So thank you for being here for today's seminar. So we're going to hear from Sandrine Codis, who's going to tell us about the impact of the large-scale structure of the universe as a probe for cosmology and for studying the environment of galaxy formation. Sandrine did her PhD at the IAP under the supervision of Dimitri Pogosyan from Alberta and myself. She then did a postdoc at CETA in Canada, working with, I guess, Dick Bond and others. And she got a CNRS position last year at IAP, and so she's with us. So, Sandrine.
Comme ça, c'est mieux. Ok, merci Christophe pour l'introduction. Je voulais juste dire un tout petit mot en français avant de commencer ma présentation. Un petit mot juste pour vous dire que ça avait été un plaisir immense pour moi de rejoindre cette belle maison qui est l'IAP il y a quelques mois maintenant. Et je voulais en profiter pour vous remercier tous pour l'accueil formidable que vous m'avez réservé quand je suis arrivée. Okay, donc, let me switch to English now. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the cosmic web, so the formation, the evolution of the cosmic web, and how this network of large cosmic highways then give birth to halos and galaxies. So it will be divided in 3 parts, and in each part I will try to give, at the beginning, some very introductory materials, and then talk to you about more recent developments or more advanced topics, so that hopefully there is something for everyone in the room. Okay, so let me start with just describing a little bit the gravitational instability. So basically, as all of you know, when we observe the distribution of galaxies, what we see is actually that galaxies are not uniformly distributed in the universe. They form this cosmic web, which is made of large bubbles, almost empty, which intersect into sheet-like structures, walls, which themselves intersect into filaments and nodes. And the reason why we observe this cosmic web is because of primordial fluctuation in the initial universe, which then grows under the laws of gravity in our expanding universe and give rise to these large-scale structures that we see today. So my talk will be mostly theoretical. I'm going to show you how we model from a theoretical point of view this large-scale structure. And to start with, I have to say some very basic things about this point of view. So as theorists, what we do is to use models for the early universe, which predict the statistics of the initial conditions. So it's very well constrained, in particular by CMB experiments. And then we need to evolve these initial conditions with a theory of gravity, a cosmological model with various components, and so on, and then compare the result of this evolution to the observation of the large-scale structures that we have. And in particular, I want to emphasize that obviously we cannot predict our single realization of the universe. So we cannot predict objects one by one, but we can predict the statistics, the probability of observing a universe with some properties. So we can predict expectation values, but also cosmic variance and so on. Okay, so in practice, how do we study the time evolution of the large-scale structure? So it's basically the Vlasov-Poisson system. So you have a first equation, which is basically a collisionless Boltzmann equation. So the volume in phase space is conserved. And then we have a Poisson equation, which basically tells you that the gravitational potential is sourced only by fluctuations of densities. So those equations are highly nonlinear. So if you want to solve for them, you can use numerical simulations. So it's one way of studying this system. Or you can try and find some exact solutions. But obviously, it won't be in any settings. It will be only in very specific regimes. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. And I would like to emphasize that these exact solutions are very important, at least to me, because they are important to understand physical processes at play in forming this large-scale structure. And so as physicists, we want to understand what's going on. And it's also important because we are now in a situation where, in particular with future surveys, we will need to model large volume of the universe. So we need to have very big simulation in order to mock the universe. But in particular, we don't need to have one single simulation of the universe. We need plenty of them because we want to predict also the statistics of the error. So what error bars we are going to put on the cosmological parameters, for instance. So we need plenty of such huge simulations, and also plenty of such huge simulation because we also want to vary the cosmological model. So it's a very high dimensional problem, and if we have exact solutions, at least in some regimes, it can be very useful in this context. Okay, so usually what we do to find exact solution is first to look only at the regime before shell crossing, so before flows of matter cross and create caustics with multi-streaming regions. And basically, what you can do, you can take the first two moments of this equation, so density and velocities, and neglect higher order contribution, like velocity dispersion, for instance, and you get this this well-known set of equations, which is continuity and Euler equation, in addition to the Poisson equation I was writing here. Okay, so how to find exact solutions? Well, first, what you can do is to put yourself in a setting which is symmetric enough so that you can exactly solve the equations. And this is possible if you impose, for instance, spherical symmetry. So you take this very idealized experiment where you have an isolated fluctuation with spherical symmetry, and then you know exactly how to solve for the time evolution of these initial spherically symmetric fluctuations. So it's a very well-known solution, and basically what happens is that if you have an overdense sphere, the sphere will first grow with the expansion of the universe, and at some point its self-gravity will be strong enough so that it will counterbalance the effect of the expansion, and the sphere is going to shrink and collapse. So this is really the spherical collapse model. And there is one important number in this game, which is that if with this model you can predict what is the linear density for which you can collapse. And this is given by this number here, delta C equals 1.7. Okay, so obviously, if we look at the large-scale structure, there is no way this model can work. We are not at all in a spherically symmetric configuration. So something else we can do, we can look at very large scales and do a perturbation theory. So basically, we are now in a regime where density fluctuations are small enough, so then you can use them as a small parameter and write down a perturbation expansion. So in this game, then you can solve the equations order by order in this perturbation expansion in delta. We can have diagrammatic representation like this. I won't enter into the details at all. It's a whole industry. But in the end, just to show you an illustration, with this approach, we can predict some observables. So here, for instance, it is the power spectrum, which is a very common observable used in this context. And you see a comparison between a numerical simulation with black crosses and perturbation theory. So perturbation theory at first order, so what we call three-order perturbation theory, so linear evolution. It's a dotted line here. And then here it's a two-loop prediction. So what you can see is that those predictions work very well in the, at large separation, so on large scales. So low K here, and at high redshift. This is where the amplitude of fluctuations are small enough so that you can have this accurate perturbation theory-based prediction. But now if you want to go a bit more deeply into the nonlinear regime, so push here the domain of validity of this kind of theory, at some point you need to introduce free parameters. And this is mandatory because somehow you need to encode your ignorance of the small-scale physics and the coupling between the small-scale and the large-scale physics. So at some point, you need to add so many extra parameters that basically you cannot extract more information from this regime. So the question you can ask is, can we find other configurations in which we don't need to introduce those plenty of free parameters to model intermediate scales? Okay, so what do we need? We need new configurations, so not the power spectrum, something else, in which we can have a solution from first principles, so predictions, in which those solutions are accurate even in a more nonlinear regime than what we can usually do with perturbation theory. And as I said, the motivation is both purely theoretical because we want to understand structure formation, but also with these big surveys, ongoing and future surveys. So what can we do? Well, we can do like we always do in theoretical physics, which is to use a symmetry. So can we use a symmetry somehow in order to prevent us from the effect of the small-scale physics that we don't know very well? And indeed, this is possible in a configuration that we call counting cells. So basically, the idea is to draw spheres in the sky. You measure the mean density in those spheres. So, for instance, you count the number of galaxies in each of those spheres, and you study the statistics of those mean densities. So in principle, it can be any number of concentric spheres, but for the sake of simplicity, I will focus on just one sphere here. So the situation is this one. You draw all the spheres and you measure the mean densities in those spheres. So here I'm showing you the distribution of those densities in spherical cells. So initially, at early times or on very large scales, this distribution of probability is almost Gaussian. This is a red curve here. But as you go to lower redshift, it becomes more and more non-Gaussian, more and more skewed towards low value of the density. And this is because voids are becoming bigger and bigger and at the same time emptier and emptier. And on the contrary, peaks are becoming more and more concentrated. So here really the driving parameter is the amplitude of fluctuation. So what we call sigma square, the variance of the field. And basically, when I go from here to here, this amplitude of fluctuation is basically growing, which is why it's a function at the same time of scales and redshift. So how can we predict, model this PDF of densities in spheres? Well, we can use perturbation theory. So with perturbation theory, we know how to compute cumulants of the field. So in particular, with perturbation theory, you can compute, for instance, these ratios, so what we call SN ratios. And perturbation theory predicts that those are numbers at first order, so constant. So what it means is that there is a hierarchy of cumulants. So you have your variance, sigma square, then the third order cumulant, so delta cube, goes like sigma to the fourth, because it's sigma to the fourth times a number. And the first order cumulant goes like sigma to the sixth, and so on. So it means that if the variance sigma is small, you can do basically Taylor expansion and truncate at some order in sigma. So this is called Edgeworth expansion in this context. So the result is given here. So you can compute the PDF of cosmic densities with a Taylor series somehow in sigma, which is written here. So how does it look like? So this is the PDF we want to model. And let me show you what the Edgeworth expansion gives you. So this is a dashed line. So basically, when the field is close to Gaussian, it seems to be very good. But as soon as you become non-Gaussian, it starts to fail completely. And it failed completely because, so here you see the PDF is not even physical. So you can have negative values. It's not even normalized, so the integral of this PDF is not 1, so it's not a measure of probability. And actually, this unphysical behavior is here for any variance. So in the red line, you cannot see it, but actually it also goes negative and it's not normalized. And this is a very famous result in mathematics, which tells you that if you look at the cumulant generating function, which is really the building block here, a cumulant generating function can be a polynomial only in the Gaussian case, so only when it is a quadratic function. So as soon as you're non-Gaussian, this cumulant generating function cannot be a polynomial. It means that if you do a Taylor expansion, you truncate at some order, you get a polynomial, so you get a non-physical PDF. So it's a big problem, and the question is, can we find a solution to this problem? Can we have a model for this PDF which gives us accurate and physical modeling of this PDF of cosmic densities? And in fact, it's possible using what's called large deviation theory in mathematics. And I'm going to show you that this large deviation theory allows you to get the cumulant generating function at all orders. So you get the full series, which is why you can get a PDF which is physical. But the price to pay is that you have some approximations for the cumulants. So let me show you how it works. Obviously, I won't show you any mathematical details. I just want to give you a bit a qualitative picture of how it works. So basically, what you want to do is the following. You want to predict the statistics of cosmic fields at late time, so in the late time universe. If you take a sphere, or several spheres, with the same mean densities, and you look at those spheres, you're going to see that the same mean density can correspond to very different microscopic states. So they correspond actually to very different configuration, but because you've only taken the mean, so you've smoothed the information, you've lost a lot of information about this patch. So it means that with the same density, you can come from very different configuration in the initial conditions. So same mean density, but different volumes in the initial conditions, different densities, and so on. So in principle, if you want to understand the statistics of these final densities, you need to do a path integral. You need to sum over all possible trajectories which link the initial conditions, for which you know the statistic very well, to the final universe. And obviously, doing this path integral is impossible in practice. This is where we can use large deviation theory. And large deviation theory is going to tell you that among all those possibilities, there is one single trajectory, one single path which is going to dominate this integral. So now the question is, we know that there is one trajectory which dominates the integral. What is this most likely trajectory? And because we have chosen spherical cells, we do the following conjecture, but it's really a conjecture, which is that probably this mean dynamics in the universe, this most likely dynamics, should be the spherical collapse dynamics, because it should probably also respect the symmetry of the configuration you're looking at. So we use this assumption, and then we can test it. Okay, so with this assumption, we can predict what is the PDF of the field using the spherical collapse. So I skip all the mathematical details, but basically it's not at all a simple change of variable. It's a really involved calculation. But in the end, you can get a prediction. And there are some very important points to make here. First, you have a prediction which is parameter-free. So it's a prediction from first principles. There is no fitting parameters that you can fit on your simulation, for instance. It's really a prediction from first principle. The dependence on cosmology is explicit. And basically, you depend on cosmology through three ingredients: the dynamics of the spherical collapse, the statistics of the initial conditions, and the driving parameter, which is the growth of structure. And there is another very important point, which is actually all those predictions are analytical. So you can write down explicitly the solution. It's 2 lines in Mathematica, with all the dependence on cosmology completely explicit, which is quite a unique situation, I guess, in the field of large-scale structure. So here is the result. So here you see measurement in simulations with error bars, and you see the prediction from large deviation theory with the solid line. And basically, you don't see any departure for all those variants. So basically, you can go up to variants of order unity, and you get a very precise agreement between the simulation and the theory. And what's, I guess, the most striking here is the fact that the accuracy is impressively good, even in the tails of the PDF. So here, this is really a very rare event. We are looking at events with probability 10 to the minus 5. And even in this regime, the theory works amazingly well. So we can do, with large deviation theory, you can predict lots of different observables. I don't have time to enter into the details, but for instance, you can predict the slope of the density field. You can also predict how correlated spheres are, so 2-point statistics, what we call the sphere bias, which is important actually to predict what is the typical scatter you expect when you measure a given PDF in a finite volume survey. We can also have a model for the PDF of halo densities, not only dark matter densities, but also bias traces. And we can also predict the statistics of the velocity field. So it means that you have a simulation, you smooth at, say, 10 megaparsec at redshift 0, and actually you can predict exactly how the distribution of velocities and density at this scale is going to look like. So this is all very nice. We have a very good understanding now of the statistics of cosmic fields at those scales. But as I said, it is in a very isotropic setting. We are looking at spheres. And when we observe this cosmic web, what's really striking in this plot is the fact that the cosmic web is highly anisotropic. So for sure, there is information which is not contained in these very simple spherically symmetric statistics. And there is information to be extracted in this anisotropic cosmic web. So in this second part, I'm going to focus now on how we can model this anisotropic cosmic web. So just a movie to entertain you first. So basically what you see here is matter escaping from the void towards the walls and the filaments, and then flowing inside the filaments towards the overdense nodes of the cosmic web, where usually large clusters of galaxies reside. So how can we model the formation of these large-scale structures, this cosmic web? How can we understand it? Well, so it all started probably somewhere around the 70s with ideas from the Russian school, in particular Yakov Zeldovich, who really gave the first understanding of why we have this anisotropic collapse of structures. And to understand this, you need to change the frame in which you're looking at the large-scale structure. So in my slide, I have showed you results in what we call the Eulerian frame. So when basically you put a grid and you look at fields in this fixed grid. But what we can do is to go to Lagrangian space. And in Lagrangian space, what you do is that your coordinate is now the initial position of particles. So it's like a simulation. You put particles in your fluid, and you're going to follow the trajectories of particles. So you have the initial position, which is called Q, and then you look at the displacement of particles in your fluid. So the quantity you're looking at is this zeta, so the displacement as a function of the initial position. So you can take your Vlasov-Poisson system and use this new set of variables here. You get some equation, and again you can do a perturbation theory, which is now in Lagrangian space. So it's the small number, the epsilon in your theory is the displacement now, not the density field anymore. So if you do that, the first order of this perturbation theory is basically straight line. So you take particles, and they will follow straight lines. So this is called the Zeldovich boost, the Zeldovich approximation. So once you have the displacement, you can compute the density, which is a derived quantity now. And this is given by this very famous formula here. And basically what you have to get from this formula is the fact that there is a denominator here, which involve this lambda I, which are eigenvalues of the deformation tensor. So it means that if you have an initial fluctuation, which is not spherical, but which has a given shape, so given curvatures, then what's going to happen is that the smaller axis will collapse first. Then at some point, this denominator will be 0, so it means that you're going to create a caustic. So you have your ellipsoid, collapse of the third axis, and creation, therefore, of a 2D planar structure, which is called in this context a Zeldovich pancake. Then you can collapse along the second axis, you form a filament, and finally the third axis, and you form a bound object, a halo, say. So with this formalism, we understand the formation of anisotropic structures, so planar structures, filamentary-like structures, and so on. But we can, maybe I should show you an illustration first. So just quickly to show you an illustration, here you see the formation of a wall. So this is phase space. You have 2 dimensions of space here, and here it's a velocity. And what you see is 2 flows of matter. So this is matter escaping from the void towards the walls and the intersection. So these 2 flows are going to cross and create a caustic that you see here in projection on real space in red. And you see the formation of a 2D planar structure, which is exactly a Zeldovich pancake. So we understand the formation of these isolated anisotropic structures, but it doesn't really give an understanding of why we observe this connected cosmic web. And to understand this, we need to wait basically 96 and this very famous paper by Dick Bond, Lev Kosman, and Dimitri Pogosyan, where I guess for the first time we really have an understanding of why we have this connected cosmic web forming. And basically the reason is in the anisotropies of the primordial cosmic fields. So in particular, if you look at this primordial field, you will see peaks with given shapes, and then the gravitational evolution will just amplify those primordial anisotropies and give rise to the cosmic web. So basically, rare peaks in the initial conditions will give rise to nodes of the cosmic web, and because those peaks have a given shape, they will form what they call correlation bridges between them, which are going to form the filaments that we see in the late-time universe. And they have this very nice experiment in this paper where you can take a simulation, look at the initial conditions. So here, this is the initial condition of the simulation. Basically, what you see here is a 1 sigma contour. And what you do, you only select the 20 most massive peaks in this simulation. And you keep just the position of the peaks, their height, and their shape. And with only this information, so in 20 location of space, then you can reconstruct what is the mean Gaussian field given those constraints. And this is what is shown here. And you can see that actually this mean field is very similar to what is in the simulation. So you recover the same large-scale cosmic web with this approximation. So this is in the initial condition, but we can also look at the gravitational evolution. And still, you see that this cosmic web remains the same, and you have, in both cases, the same large-scale cosmic web. So this means that really, the progenitor of the cosmic web are in the high peaks of the initial conditions, and in particular, the tides, the shear at this peak location, which are going to really set the directions of the filaments. So it tells you that to understand, so in the context of the cosmic web, there are two theories that are really very important. Peak theories, because we are looking at peaks in the initial conditions, and the theory of constrained random field. Okay, so now we have this picture in mind where we can define the skeleton of the cosmic web in the following way. So this is so a large part of this picture which was actually developed here at IAP. So we have this picture in mind where basically a filament is a field line that joins peaks through saddle points. So it's really like a mountain, and you join the peaks of the mountain following the crest lines through the saddle points. So this is the picture we have in mind to describe this cosmic web, this skeleton. And we can use this idea to, for instance, develop algorithms to extract the cosmic web from simulation and observation. We can also develop a local theory to understand the properties of those skeleton branches. So for instance, we can do predictions, and again, I won't show you the mathematical details, but we can predict the statistics of extrema, so the statistics of peaks and saddle points and minima of the field. We can also predict what is the typical length of filaments and how many filaments you can find in a given volume, what is the surface of voids, the curvatures also of those voids and, well, say, walls and filaments. And all of these observables are very competitive cosmological probes, actually. Something else you can also look at in this cosmic web is how well peaks are connected. So how many filaments connect to a given peak. This is what we call cosmic connectivity. And this is something I'm working on right now, so I'm going to say a few words about it. So in this example here, for instance, you see this central peak here, and you see 3 filaments sticking out of this peak. So the connectivity is 3 in this case. But is it a typical behavior? Do we expect on average, to have 3 filaments connecting to a peak? Well, this is something we can actually compute. But first, let me show you a larger field. So here you see peaks, and you see how many filaments are connected to each peak. So you see that it's not always 3. It can be 2. It can be even 7. Sometimes you can be very connected. And we can compute, actually, the expectation value of this quantity. And this is very easy to do, because we know that one saddle point is always connected to only 2 peaks. So this means that the mean connectivity in this field will simply be twice the number of saddle points divided by the number of peaks. And for Gaussian random field, this is something we can compute exactly. So for instance, in 2 dimensions, like this map, the expected connectivity is exactly 4. So it means it's like a cubic lattice on average. Okay, so maybe in 3D it's also a cubic lattice. Well, so in that case, it would mean that connectivity should be 6 in 3D. Well, you can do the calculation, and actually it's not 6. It's this exact number, which is 6.11. So somehow there is some kind of defect. It's not exactly a cubic lattice in 3D. Okay, so this is the mean value of the connectivity, but you can also look at the full distribution of connectivity in a field. So here you see the full distribution of cosmic connectivity for different power spectra, but it doesn't change really the result. So you see that on average, indeed, so here it's 3D, on average it's more or less 6, but you can also have very large values. Sometimes peaks are connected to 15 or even 20 neighbors. So this is for Gaussian random field. But actually, cosmic connectivity depends on time. So there is a time evolution. And before the time evolution, there is also an evolution with the height of the peak. So if you look at peaks with different height, on average, they will have different connectivity. So very large peaks, very massive peaks, will tend to be very connected to their surrounding. And on the contrary, small peaks will be connected to sometimes 2, 3, 4, but not more neighbors only. So now the time evolution. So in 3D, it's 6.1 for a Gaussian random field, which means at early times. But then you can look at the time evolution of this connectivity. So basically, it's going to decrease with cosmic times because filaments are going to merge when we go towards low redshift. But what you can see is that actually this evolution with cosmic time depends on the cosmological model. So here, for instance, you see the difference between the lambda CDM and the CDM universe. So if you look at how cosmic connectivity evolves with time, you can say something actually about the cosmological model, and in particular about dark energy, which may be an interesting way of having cosmological constraints. And maybe I just want to mention about connectivity that it's interesting in the context of cosmology, but it's also interesting in the context of galaxy formation. Because if you think about a galaxy sitting at a node, a very massive node of the cosmic web, this node will be connected a lot to the surrounding. So it means that this galaxy is going to acquire material almost in isotropic fashion. So it's going to be difficult to acquire coherent angular momentum and build disks, for instance. On the contrary, if you sit in a peak which is not that much connected to the environment, you will tend to acquire materials along along precise directions set by 2 filaments, for instance. So you can acquire coherent angular momentum and build disks, maybe in this case. Okay, so let me go to the last part of my talk. I've described a bit how we understand the formation of the cosmic web, how we can characterize it and study it. Now, what about halos and galaxies within this cosmic web? So how do we understand halo formation? Well, so it started with ideas in the 70s, in particular Press and Schechter, who used the spherical collapse model. And they said, okay, in the spherical collapse model, we need to pass a given threshold in order to collapse. And this threshold, I told you, it was 1.686. So what we can do is to say that if we want to model the fraction of mass in collapsed object at a given redshift, we just need to look at the initial conditions and see where we have the density greater than this density threshold set by the spherical collapse model. So this works pretty well, and it allows to explain some phenomena. For instance, you understand with this idea that you're going to get biased clustering. So if you are in a dense environment, so for instance, here you have a long wave mode fluctuation, which is, say, a filament. So if you sit at the location of the filament or a node in a dense environment, it's going to be much easier to pass the threshold for collapse. And on the contrary, if you are in a void, it's going to be very difficult to reach this threshold. So it means that most of halos are going to form in dense environment, and they are going to be clustered in a very specific way. The problem with this theory is that actually there is a factor of 2 missing. So if you count which volume is in object of any mass, basically you only find half of the volume instead of the full volume. And this is because of the so-called cloud-in-clouds problem. So basically you're going to miss underdense regions that are trapped in larger overdense regions. So this problem was, so the first solution to this problem was proposed in 91. And basically the idea was to add a condition of first crossing. So how does it look like? Well, you can measure the density in spheres of decreasing radius. So this is what is shown here. The density as a function of, so here it's not the radius, it's the amplitude of fluctuation, but it's a bijection between the two. So here it means you're looking at very large scales. So the amplitude of fluctuation is very small and the density is almost zero. Then you decrease the scale, you start to get non-zero densities. And in fact, this is a random walk. So from one step to the next, you jump in this random walk. And at some point, you can pass the threshold. So this 1.7 threshold for collapse. And what you're going to look at is actually the time when you pass this threshold for the first time. And this way, if you do calculations this way, you won't miss these underdense regions that are trapped in overdense regions. So therefore, we can solve this factor of 2 problem. And actually, with these ideas, you can predict mass function for halos that are very similar to what we see in simulations. You can also try and go one step further and replace the spherical collapse model by an ellipsoidal collapse model. And the idea is that at very large mass, the spherical collapse model is reasonably good to explain the dynamics of very massive objects. But if you go to smaller mass, at some point the tides are important. So there is an initial shear which is important, and the initial shear will basically delay the time at which you can collapse. You can imagine a shear acting on the object. It will tend to prevent the object from collapsing. So you need more time to collapse. So in that case, you can try and use an ellipsoidal collapse model instead of the spherical collapse. But it's very difficult to add this ingredient in this exclusion set formalism. And what people have done is actually to do it in an effective manner, which is to change the threshold. So instead of having this constant threshold, which is only true for the very massive object, you can try and increase the threshold at low mass so that you can delay the time at which you can collapse. So this is called the moving barrier. You can calibrate it on simulation and it works very well. Problem is, this is not a prediction. This is calibrated on simulation. So is there a way we can actually predict the formation of halo without the need for simulation to do some kind of calibration? So this is possible in what's called the peak patch picture. And I would like to describe this in a bit more detail. So it's a way to model halo formation without any calibration or fitting. So it's really prediction in the context of this model. So how do you model a halo formation in this context? So you take your initial conditions, and then what you do is you look for regions in these initial conditions that are going to collapse according to the ellipsoidal collapse model. So in practice, you cannot look at all possible locations of space, at all possible scales, and so on. So what you do is that you restrict yourself to peaks in the initial conditions. Then at the location of a peak, you compute the density and the shear for each possible scales, and you select the largest scale at which the ellipsoidal collapse model tells you that you can indeed collapse at the redshift of interest. So this way, you get a catalog of possible halo position, so possible position where you can form a bound object at the redshift of interest. So you get a halo catalog, but then there is a very important step, which is that in this catalog, you're going to have patches that are maybe overlapping at some point. And you don't want to count matter twice. So if you have 2 patches overlapping, at some point, you need to choose whether the matter at the intersection goes to one halo or the other. So you need to do what's called exclusion, which is really a physical effect in halo formation. So this is the first step. So you do this exclusion. And then you also need to displace your halo. Halo are going to move from the initial conditions to the late-time universe. And for that, you can use Lagrangian perturbation theory, which is a solution that you know. But there is a small subtleties here, which is that actually it's an adaptive Lagrangian perturbation theory in the sense that you compute displacement at the scale of the halo you're looking at. And because it's an adaptive Lagrangian perturbation theory, it works actually very well. So if you do all these steps, then you end up with a catalog of halos. And what's interesting is that this way you can build a halo catalog in a very efficient way. So just to give you an idea, for instance, we tried this, which was a box of 8 gigaparsec, 4096 cube particles, and it took 10 minutes to run on our cluster. So it's very efficient, and actually the difference with N-body is quite small. So here you see a comparison between these peak patch halos and the N-body run. And they are, well, it's very similar. So here it was done with a first order displacement, but you can also go to second order, and you see that the agreement is even better in this case. So I can go back and forth if you want to see. Okay, so this is just a visual impression of how it works, but we can also have some quantitative measurements. So here, for instance, you see the halo mass function. So you have the present Schechter prediction with dashed line, so it's a prediction from spherical collapse. Then you have a measurement in an N-body simulation given by the Tinker mass function. It's a dotted line that you can see here. And on top, you see the prediction of the peak patch picture. And you see that it gives very good result. So we are all complete up to, say, 10 to the 13 solar mass halo or something like this. So it seems to work very well at the level of halo mass function. So with this product, you can do plenty of things. You can build MOCs, which is a very important industry in the context of galaxy surveys. And you can build MOCs for different observables. So here it's a few MOCs we did. So for instance, CMB lensing, H1, Sunyaev-Zeldovich effect, CIB, in the optical also, and so on. So it's very interesting because it allows you, for instance, to investigate cross-correlations, which is something very difficult because to do cross-correlation, you need big volumes. And here with the peak patch picture, it's given almost for free. And you can do plenty of simulations. So here it's, I don't know, maybe 2,000 simulations or something like this. So because you can do plenty of simulations, it means that you can investigate covariance matrices. So what is the typical errors you expect when you measure, for instance, the power spectrum in a box of a given volume, for instance. This is something which is very important for future survey and that you can investigate very easily with this peak patch approach. So you can do likelihood analysis. You can also look at different cosmological models. So for instance, for lambda CDM, you can vary the cosmological parameters, but you can also put non-Gaussian initial conditions, dynamical dark energy, neutrinos, modification of gravity, anything you want, and very easily you can see what is the impact on the observable you want to investigate. You can look at power spectrum, but also higher order statistics if you want. So all of this is very interesting for future survey, but as a theorist, the reason why I like this approach is because it's a laboratory to understand halo formation. So in particular, now that you have this halo catalog, you can look at, for instance, what is the density of those halos in the initial conditions. So this is shown here. You see halo density as a function of mass. So if the spherical collapse was exact, you should get that the density is always 1.7. But actually what you see is that this is a function of mass, and it is almost 1.7 for large mass, but at small mass, you see that you need to have a larger threshold. So this is exactly the moving barrier we need in excursion set formalism. And here it is predicted by this peak patch approach. You can also look at the gradient of the field at the location of halos. So if halos were peaks in the initial conditions, the gradients should be 0. Actually, the peak patch approach tells you that it's not always 0. So here it's the log of the amplitude of the gradient. So it's minus infinity if it's a peak. So you see that it's very small indeed for massive objects, but for low mass halos, it is not really 0. And basically it tells you that the peak approximation is not very good for low mass halos, which is indeed something that we see in simulations. And here is predicted by this peak patch approach. You can also investigate how halos are correlated. So you can have prediction for the clustering of halos. You can investigate halo bias, so which is the modulation by long density modes and curvature modes. So here, for instance, you have a measurement, a prediction for the linear halo bias, or here the chi-square contribution, so the scale dependence of halo bias. And all of these are predictions from this peak patch approach. You can also see the peak background split at play, so this bias clustering. So even by eye, you see that this peak patch approach tells you indeed that massive objects are going to be located in the densest part of the universe. So you can look at densities, mass, but you can also look at the initial shear of this object. So here it's a work which was done with a summer student at CITA, Bruno, who is now at the master of the observatory now. And what he did was to look at the shear in the initial conditions of all those halos. So it's represented with ellipsoid here. And what you clearly see in this picture, maybe I should do a zoom. What you can clearly see is that the initial shear acting of these halos are very correlated and on very large scales. And they are correlated with the direction of the filaments. So you have initial shear alignments on very large scales. And this is very important for weak lensing experiments, actually. So obviously it was just a visual impression, but you can do quantitative measurements. So here, this is a way to measure, indeed, how the shear is aligned with filaments and how you get shear alignment. So what we do is that for each halo, we place ourselves in the frame of the shear tensor, and then we compute the distribution of halos in this frame. So this is given by the color coding from blue to red. So here I have a halo with a shear in this direction, and you see that you're going to have neighboring halos in very particular direction, which is actually along filaments. So if you have a halo with a given shear, basically you form a filament in the direction of your shear. And you see also that there is an exclusion zone. So it's very difficult to have halos very close to you. You need to go at a given distance to see some halos. And this is a function of mass. So you see, for instance, how this exclusion zone grows with the mass of halos. On those plots, there is not only a color coding, but there is also headless arrows. And those headless arrows show you the direction of the shear. So in this position, the shear is along this direction, and I compute what is the expected value of the shear in another location. So what you see is that you have alignment of the shear tensor along filaments on very large scales. For instance, here you see it's 20 megaparsec away, and still the correlation is very strong between those 2 points. So in the initial conditions, the shear alignments are very strong and on very large scales, which is why it's a worry for a weak lensing experiment. And this is a worry because if you have shear alignment in the initial conditions like this, it means that these initial tides will tend to stretch halos. So if you form halos in these regions where the shear is strong, they will acquire a shape which is also along this direction. So if you have shear alignment in the initial conditions, it means that you're going to have alignment of the shapes of halos and galaxies at low redshift, which is really a worry for weak lensing experiments. So you can have alignments of the shapes of halos and galaxies, and you can also have alignments of the spin of this object. Because if you have a tidal field, this tidal field will induce a torque acting on the halo during this formation. And therefore, if the shear is correlated on large scales, you will tend to form halos with spin also aligned with themselves and with the cosmic web. So this is an effect which can also be investigated in simulations. So how halos and galaxies align themselves and their spin with the cosmic web. And there have been a lot of work, in particular here at IAP, on this topic. So for instance, we have been using a dark matter simulation to indeed show that the spin of halos is aligned with the axis of filaments. So it means that if you look at halos in filaments, big halos will tend to have a spin perpendicular to filaments, and small halos aligned with the axis of filaments. So this is something that we measure indeed in simulations. This is true for halos, but also for galaxies. And there is some ongoing work with a summer student of mine on exactly this effect, so the alignment of spin of galaxies in horizon AGN. And basically, we see the same effect. So elliptical galaxies tend to have a spin perpendicular to the axis of filament, and spiral galaxies aligned with the axis of filaments. So we can measure it in simulation, but we can also model it from first principles. So we can use constrained random field theory to predict how spins align themselves with the axis of filaments and with the cosmic web. And basically, it is completely consistent with what we can measure in simulations. And because we have this alignment of the shape and spin of galaxies with the cosmic web, it means that galaxies will tend to orient themselves one with respect to the other. So they will tend to be aligned. And this is a problem for lensing, as I was telling you, just an illustration of this fact. So what lensing basically is measuring is a tangential deformation of the shape of galaxies around overdensities. So here it's in the strong regime, obviously. With a survey like Euclid, we are going to look at this effect in the weak regime, but it is the same idea. So we want, with this coherent deformation of the shape of galaxies, to measure the cosmic shear and therefore say something about cosmology, so dark energy, dark matter, and so on. And you see that this kind of pattern is very similar to what we have intrinsically due to the cosmic web. So it means that if we want to measure, to extract information from weak lensing experiment, we need to disentangle what comes from this cosmic shear that tend to deform galaxies and what comes intrinsically from the effect of the long wave mode of the cosmic web on galaxy shapes. And just an illustration of why this is important, in particular for Euclid. Here you see the typical constraints that Euclid is going to put on cosmological parameters. So in black, it is a case where there is no intrinsic alignment. And in red, you see the case where we have intrinsic alignments and we don't model them, we don't account for them. So you see that there is a systematic bias which is not at all negligible. So there is it's very important to be able to model accurately those intrinsic alignment. And I should say that today this is still an open issue and we don't know completely how we can solve this problem for now. So I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to stop here at the conclusion.
You showed that the peak patch model, that the small halos cannot really be considered peaks in that approach. So what can you do to model small halos? Do you have to use a completely different approach, or can you extrapolate in some way?
So in the peak patch approach, we don't assume that they are peaks. What we do is just to look at peaks so as to guide us in the initial conditions, but then we look at all scales and they are not necessarily peaks. So in the peak patch approach, there is no peak approximation, and we can really model even the small halos.
You could extrapolate your model down to much lower masses than 10 to the 13.
Yes.
Okay.
So at some point there is a problem. So we cannot be completely complete for small mass objects just because we are doing measurements in spherical cells. Okay. And at some point this approximation of measurements in spherical cells simply breaks down. But we can imagine, well, more sophisticated way of doing measurements in the initial conditions. So for instance, maybe just to say a few more words, there are people, grad students at CETA, working on using a neural network in order to actually do this in an implicit way, and this works actually amazingly well. So in that case, you don't need to assume any spherical way of doing measurements. This is all done implicitly by this approach.
You mentioned that the peak patch theory reproduces very well the halo mass function, and then you say this is a justification to build MOCs. But I presume, and I presume you also tested that it produces the right clustering.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Because by essence it should.
Exactly. So for instance, we've done checked on the power spectrum in real and redshift space, and it works very well.
Did you check high order?
No, not yet. This is the next step.
Okay. Have you tried to predict cosmological parameters from a small scale, because it is where your model is more exact than linear perturbations. Have you tried to predict from data? Or?
So I assume your question is about the use of the PDF as a cosmological probe?
Taking your simulations and comparing with data to see if you can obtain cosmological parameters from in this way.
Yes, exactly. So that's exactly what we do, actually. So
and do you see any difference? Can you reproduce or the range of error that you can you have in your predictions or something? You didn't show anything related to really comparing your simulation with data to say, okay, I obtained this parameter.
Okay, so I don't know exactly what to say, but we are exactly using this simulation to do cosmological inference, if this is your question. So it's a way to have a consistent model. So you can build mocks from this simulation with very different cosmological parameters and so on, and therefore be able to investigate the likelihood surface, for instance, this kind of thing. So this is really ongoing work.
Yes, Sandrine, it was a very nice talk, and I have a question of clarification about the geometry of the cosmic web is a key for galaxy evolution. You are speaking on mass of galaxy, that's all. On the mass distribution, what do you mean by galaxy evolution? So it's a mass evolution?
You're talking about the effect of the cosmic web on galaxies? Is it your question? Yes, so it has an effect on mass, obviously, that's something we know very well, but also on other quantities like the angular momentum of galaxy and lots of different other characteristics. With star formation, probably yes, because all of this is correlated, but I don't know, maybe Johan, you have a more precise answer for this.
Any more questions?
But for instance, we know that star-forming galaxies correlate with the cosmic web in a different way than passive galaxies, for instance. So this is something which has been measured, for instance, in Horizon AGN.
No more questions? Everybody's hungry? Just a comment maybe on the last question. Obviously the cosmic web affects galaxy assembly history, which itself will impact the colors of galaxies, for instance. Okay, well, thanks again, Sandrine.